Dr. Hannah Gibbs is an anthropological archaeologist completing postgraduate study at the University College of London, and a researcher with extreme citizen science, analysis, and visualization. Her work deploys story tracking and collaborative mapping to highlight how indigenized and community-directed recording and management of cultural landscapes provides equal benefit to local communities, specialists, and environments. Her talk will be on Indigenous-led approaches to managing archaeological landscapes, achieving equity, and improving the discipline. Take it away.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. Good morning or good evening or good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm coming to you from a predictably wet and cold England. So I'm very excited to be able to talk to you a bit about somewhere a bit warmer in Belize's Maya region. Thank you very much for that introduction. And any questions you have at the end, I'll be very pleased to listen to. It's really exciting to be part of this project and all of these talks that we heard yesterday and today and tomorrow. I'm really excited to be a part of this and to follow such a passionate presentation as well. So I'll start. If you can all see my screen and you can all hear me, then let's go. I'll just summarize a bit what I'm going to talk to you about. I'll introduce Belize's Maya region, what the management of archaeological sites is all about, how space has been made for community involvement in that kind of thing, what Indigenous involvement in the management of archaeological sites looks like, what Indigenous-led approaches to managing archaeological sites looks like, and then my case studies, which is the community-directed heritage workshops in Toledo, the community-translated illustrated book based at Kayat Swits, Sukut Senyos, and Shenantonich. So first, I'll talk to you a bit about the management of archaeological sites. Some of you might understand it. It's a discipline concerned with the various elements that make up an archaeological site, such as aspects such as the monumental architecture or the aesthetic presence, historical importance, cultural significance, scientific knowledge, or spiritual presence of the site. Management seeks to incorporate also the populations that research, use, value, visit, or rely on the site. And then in incorporating these, the management of archaeological sites also seeks to evaluate why the site is preserved and how local and international power relationships, perceptions, and interpretations of contemporary values impact practices at the site. Ultimately, the management aims to sort of successfully manage the use, conservation, presentation, and preservation of the significance of these places. There are, I'm sure you can guess, a couple of key international principles and recommendations that made space for community involvement in this quite regimented discipline. The first one is the Borough Charter from 1979, which made a truly profound impact by arguing that cultural significance should be at the centre of the methodology employed to manage an archaeological site. This is something that we call values-based management, and it recognises that individuals and communities attribute values. And so these values are changeable and driven by ideas and circumstances and opinions, rather than being intrinsically a presence in the physical materials of the archaeological site. So this is where we begin to see various stakeholder groups, local and Indigenous communities being involved in management. The second key document is the NARA document on authenticity from 1994, which challenged the supremacy of material authenticity, and it established that authenticity is relative. This opened the way for a greater consideration of the sustainable use of historic buildings and archaeological sites, and it also paved the way for a wider adaptation of maintenance and sort of traditional approaches to site maintenance and management. Then the next one is the E-Commerce Declaration of San Antonio from 1996, which argued that the use, function, and identity of a site are integral to the way that it should be managed. I'm going to quote from this actually, from point 4, which is the quote of historic research and surveys of the physical fabric are not enough to identify the full significance of a heritage site, since only the concerned communities that have a stake in the site can contribute to the understanding and expression of the deeper values of the site as an anchor to their cultural identity. The next one, I'm sure you've all heard of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And then Article 11.1 is particularly relevant to us, which says that Indigenous peoples have the right to protect past manifestations of their culture, such as archaeological and historical sites. The next one is the Declaration of Paris from 2011, which states that the focus should be on heritage conservation and management as an asset for development. It argued that a process that incorporates tangible and intangible cultural heritage is a vital aspect of sustainability and development for local and Indigenous communities. It acknowledged the impact of globalization on heritage and argued that we need action to not only protect heritage, but to ensure that when it's used, promoted, enhanced, and elements of economic, social, and cultural value attributed, they are directly connected and harnessed to the benefit of local Indigenous communities. Then, in 2013, the Borough Charter was updated to add, based on all of this, to add that groups and individuals and communities with associations with the site should be able to have opportunities to participate in management and conservation as well. So now that I've explained some of the arguments being made for Indigenous-led approaches to being involved in archaeological sites, I'm going to introduce you to Belize's Maya region. So the Maya region is generally considered to be Belize, El Salvador, Guatemala, southern Mexico, and western Honduras. It's composed of ethno-linguistic groups, such as you can see here on this map, which speak or have spoken a language classified as a member of the Mayan language family. In Belize, which is the country just here, these areas are within the northern Cayo and Toledo districts on the western border, and they primarily include the Mopan and Yucatec languages. Although the people and places in these regions are consolidated into this sort of contemporary Maya identity, the Maya region is not and has never been a single cultural or political entity, so cultural practice varies widely within the region. Until recently, there wasn't really an all-encompassing identity associated with the term Maya, and some contemporary populations do not consider themselves Maya, or they use the term derogatively. The local and Indigenous populations who live in these areas may or may not identify as Maya or Indigenous, although they have shared the same status as First Peoples within the Belizean government since at least the 16th century. They've been exposed to a variety of different experiences, and they've formed a variety of identities and cultural landscapes, although the majority of their archaeological sites, which look like this second picture here, do exist in this area with the languages. I want to acknowledge before we move on that the idea of indigeneity in this sphere is quite contentious because it emerges from a backdrop of colonialism and the loss of language and land and culture. When we discuss Indigenous identity in Belize's Maya region, we look at the concept relationally. So it's been grounded at birth or created by practice. Within the discipline of archaeology, there is this idea that there's a homogeneous ancient Maya identity. That impacts how the contemporary Maya population is perceived. There's a huge variability across the Maya region in how people relate, if at all, to the past and the extent to which they want to be involved in its management. But the belief that individuals who live in or around these archaeological sites are descended from these ancient Maya creates expectations about the role that these people want to play in contemporary Indigenous archaeological sites. Indigenous involvement, however, in the management of these archaeological sites has been a presence. It's most famously been impacted by the concept of outstanding universal values, which is a perspective which has been considered dominant that's typically excluded perspectives from outside of the global north. And it exemplifies the huge variation in value that we see within the heritage sector. The methods within the system for designing and defining outstanding universal value, they typically exclude systems of value which do not come from the Western epistemology. And they detail the kind of financial support that archaeological sites reveal, which is then linked to the colonial base of our professional archaeological discourse. Indigenous involvement in the management of archaeological sites has been impacted by approaches which consider the particular values assigned to landscapes by interested parties and populations concerned, and recognise that ascribed values are in part the product of local communities, extending beyond communities of archaeological specialists. This is where we begin to see a greater involvement as well from the 70s and 80s, a subdiscipline in archaeology called Indigenous archaeology, which arose out of global anti-colonial movements led by Indigenous people in settler colonial nations like the United States and Canada and Australia. We then have this other movement called post-colonial archaeology. And in Belize, that seeks to incorporate the struggles of Indigenous peoples and broaden how knowledge is produced. Nonetheless, Indigenous involvement continues to be underrepresented and under-recognized as significant and impactful as a method for managing the archaeological sites. Indigenous-led approaches tend to be defined by Indigenous groups. They emphasize multiple public values with a particular focus on the values of those of descent communities. They involve an active level of participation in the management of archaeological sites. We define them as also including the group reaching out to archaeologists to start the work or initiating strategies and management plans. They also include elements where the community is totally involved in all aspects of the project, or they take pride in the project. The Indigenous-led approach particularly encourages the participation of Indigenous and subaltern communities who have, through colonisation, been disenfranchised from and lost rights to their archaeological heritage and the management. Indigenous-led approaches facilitate an inclusive approach which draws upon multiple and varied forms of knowledge in this regard, and they challenge modernist conceptions of expertise, which prioritize archaeological management experts. They also recognize we have a deeper understanding of cultural values is fundamental to cooperative, ongoing use and maintenance of archaeological sites by contemporary groups, and how histories can be classified as more or less valuable by powerful groups. In the Maya region, archaeology has been really heavily influenced by European and American explorers, neocolonial politics, and the resulting attitudes towards Indigenous groups. Indigenous communities have played a significant and influential roles in archaeological practice, but this has largely gone unrecognised. In Belize, all archaeological sites are in the hands of the state, and all pre-Hispanic heritage is believed to belong to all Belizeans, which means that archaeological management has prioritised the preservation of ancient Maya archaeological sites. Contemporary Maya culture in this regard is sort of created and manipulated, even though many local and Indigenous communities are positioned as descendants of the ancient Maya. They may or may not choose to self-identify as Maya. Some may choose to self-identify based on the tourism interest, for example, in ancient Maya. But an Indigenous-led approach to archaeological management challenges this pan-Maya identity, and it repositions contemporary Maya as descendants of the Maya. This kind of approach is essential due to the powerful forces in Belize that exclude Indigenous and local peoples from their past and participating in the heritage tourism industry, which is financially very lucrative, built upon these ancient sites. Now that we've had a time to understand these kind of approaches, I'm going to introduce you to and discuss some examples of these management strategies. The first is in this most southern district, Toledo, where community-directed heritage workshops were undertaken in collaboration with the Indigenous Society, the Julian Cho Society, with schools. These presentations and workshops were based on archaeological sites, iconography, animals and plants of the Maya region, and they emphasized archaeological sites that have been or are being developed for tourism. When we consider the student responses to suggestions about how to conserve old Maya places, they primarily include comments about protecting or taking care of sites or objects. The ethics of conservation is not unfamiliar to Indigenous children in rural schools in Belize. And another popular response was about not vandalizing sites or stealing. And these responses were most prevalent amongst schools and communities located next to large archaeological sites, perhaps because in the past we've seen the defacing of archaeological sites as a protest directed directly towards the government of Belize. Teacher responses, on the other hand, indicated that learning about Maya civilization was most important, and that learning about the traditions and customs of ancestors helps to protect the living Maya culture. One teacher summarized the importance of the workshops as they emphasize the importance of conserving our Maya temples and prevention from further destruction and exploitation from the so-called conservationists known as the archaeologists. So archaeologists not getting a very good rap in this report. The term exploitation here explicitly refers to the practice of excavation by archaeologists, as the Belizean government uses this excavation to enable a site to be open for tourism and then financially benefit from the entrance fee that they charge to tourists. This approach that we see here in the terms of managing an archaeological site represents and includes the multivocal communities of Indigenous people in Belize's Maya region who have an opinion on and want to challenge typical approaches to the management of archaeological sites in their community. The second example and the third example will be from this district here, just north of Toledo, the Cayo district. The example I've got here, the community translated illustrated book based at Kayatswitz, was produced by Fajina, which is a Maya word that means communal labor. They published the illustrated trilingual Maya, Spanish, and English with Yucatec audio children's book called To the Mountain. The book is about two fictional Maya children who lived during the late classic Maya period, which is about 600 to 900 BCE, around Xinanxanich, and is based on many cultural aspects of the ancient Maya and documented archaeological information from the site. It includes depictions of Xinanxanich, including the tower or El Castillo, which we see here in this image, as it would have looked at the time. And it sets the story in Sucuts, a rural village in the Belizean countryside. Community members from the Maya village of nearby San Antonio provided the Yucatec translation and audio. The approach that we see here challenges the prototypical power structures and had a significant impact on the conservation work of the Castillo, as you see here, pictured. The next example I have is from Xinanxanich, which you can see here in the photograph, which is an ancient Maya classic ceremonial center situated north of the Mopan River, which runs east to west through Belize, in a neotropical broadleaf forest, and again in the west of the country. This place includes monumental architecture, carvings and inscriptions like we saw in the previous slide, and it has a landscape of long-term human-nature interaction in the forest. The site has one of the longest continuous sequences of human occupation in Belize's Maya region, and it's one of 17 sites made legally protected terrestrial areas and granted reserve status. It's been formally recognised as an archaeological reserve since 1995, and it was the first archaeological site in the country to be open to visitors. We have written records which indicate that members of the neighbouring village of Sucuts or Sucutseños have been involved in the archaeology at the site since 1891. However, the most recent national survey of the management plans of Belize's protected areas was denied access to copies of any key documents involved in management here, and Visit failed to find any, concluding that there was not enough information to evaluate the effectiveness of management here. As of 2021, it's not been possible to access any further information regarding management and conservation structures in place, any boundaries, any threats, specific management objectives. It's not also been possible to find a record of additional heritage conservation documents, official endorsement of a management plan, details of a lead officer or steering group. This is reflected in research that I undertook in Sucuts. Many Sucutseños work in roles relevant to archaeology at Xinanxanich. Many participate in the work to earn money, and the village is generally acknowledged to be economically dependent on Xinanxanich. The commercialization of the archaeological record in the promotion of tourism in this region is distinctive because of the impact of proprietary attitude to the past by the state, and the utilization of a pan-Maya identity in tourism frequently excludes this indigenous Maya community from interpreting, managing, and benefiting economically from the site. However, Xinanxanich's designation as a reserve does provide an opportunity to address the conservation and management of this part of the Maya forest and associated cultural heritage, and cooperate with those undertaking successful management practice in the forest nearby. These projects nearby have established conservation areas and cultural heritage management practices in their relevant parts of the forest. The management of the site of Xinanxanich is negatively impacting the community of Sucuts, with members being unable to access the forest and the use of traditional resources available there used in making instruments, houses, food, just as some of examples. The opportunity also to move within and use the forest impacts the sense of identity that people have in Sucuts. Indigenous management would address this issue. This management would include mission and vision statements, the set of values guiding decision-making, maintenance, training and development programs, and most significantly, programs to enhance local community welfare while conserving the values of the site. The forest is seen to contain the life histories of the Sukhothenians and the histories of those who have built and used and included in Shenantonich. So it's an important approach that we don't see being undertaken, unfortunately. But I've tried to engage with you some of these issues that are critical to the well-being of both the Indigenous Maya communities of southern and western Belize and the environments which include the archaeological sites. I've tried to lay out some information to show you that Indigenous-led approaches better engage populations from outside the expert community, and they can achieve epistemological equity in science, academia, heritage, and tourism. These approaches improve the archaeological management discipline, and they benefit archaeological landscapes and the communities who live near them. Often in the Belize's Maya region, the communities living near these sites and using them are experiencing changes in the way they can access the local environment because of the impact and prioritization by the state of archaeological tourism. Indigenous-led management of archaeological sites in this region actively recognises the political, economic and social situation of the local community, and engagement with the management of archaeological sites in Belize's Maya region by Indigenous communities challenges prototypical power structures and demonstrates a more equitable and lifelike approach to the management of archaeological sites. This here is my last image from that lovely warm place, but I'm very grateful to you all for staying with me, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Well done.
Thank you.
Let's open this up for questions, comments, discussion. And that can come from anyone online as well as in the room.
Ooh. There we are.
Why don't you?
I must have been too thorough.
Huh?
I must have been too thorough.
Well, no. Close off your screen share.
Doctor, I do have a question.
Hi.
Hi. I'm just curious, is there a organized movement of Mayans to preserve their culture and these sites? And is it sustainable or is it waning? I'm just wondering, is it growing in strength?
That's a great question, which I could do a whole other presentation on, I'm sure. But I think essentially the key way to answer that is that, yes, there's a growing sort of movement for Indigenous sovereignty within the country and within the wider Maya region that allows people a greater say and a greater impact on the way that sites are preserved or accessed. I'm not sure if we can actively say that the impact is massive just because the financial resources tend to come from within the state and within governments, which aren't necessarily always led by Indigenous groups. But there's certainly a movement towards that preservation and management being linked to Indigenous sovereignty.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Very nice talk. And quick question. What is the situation of the representation of Indigenous people among archaeologists and the member of the government that take decisions about this? Are there like Indigenous archaeologists in Belize? Are there like governmental officers that have an Indigenous background? And are they like many, just a few? How is the situation?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. And I'll have to add all of these points to the next time I give this talk. A lot of the time when we think of Indigenous, we're looking at people who self-identify as Indigenous within Belize. And so in that case, it's a little bit harder because legally people don't necessarily have to give that information out. So while we know that someone might come, for example, the regions I've discussed or the villages I've discussed, someone might come from there, they may or may not identify as Indigenous. That's why when I think about, we're talking about Indigenous in the region, I position it as someone who experiences it rather than has to identify it. So yes, in that regard, there are lots of people involved in archaeology, and as well, the international understanding of niche might be as a Belize's Cultural Heritage Institute. Lots and lots of people who are involved in Indigenous communities are part of those states.
over the past 3 days, there have been really exceptional presentations that, archaeological presentations that actually have challenged the Academy of Archaeology and how it interfaces or relates with indigenous people, indigenous sites. And certainly this has been very much a part of your talk. How is the government relating to your work and what it stands for in Belize?
I think there's multiple different ways in which there's a relation to it. So you'll see that I've put on my slide that myself and some colleagues are presenting at another international conference in a similar sort of topic. And we have some people from the National Institute of Cultural Heritage joining us and some people not. So there isn't necessarily a statewide or government-wide response to this criticism. It tends to be people who are within the discipline either agree, and people who've practiced in Belize or who are from Belize either agree that this criticism is relevant and necessary and appropriate, or people do not agree. And as I said, there are lots of people who are involved in archaeological practice in Belize who are from Indigenous communities who see that this criticism is a part of their everyday interaction with archaeology. And it might be that if you practice archaeology somewhere else and you don't engage with Indigenous issues and you don't engage with issues of decoloniality, that it's not something that's relevant for you. I have some colleagues who I really enjoy working with because they are very engaged and very reflective and they recognise the relevance of this criticism. And then I have some colleagues who are less engaged with that.
Yes. I'm actually part of the, well, I was a co-hire. When I was hired so that I'd be in both anthropology, where my tenure is, and Native American studies. And in the anthropology department, there's a number of archaeologists, one of whom actually works in Belize, who could have really benefited from hearing what you had to say, because all of them in one way or another are working with at Indigenous sites, but they're not here.
Well, it might be that your colleague makes the same kind of talk whenever they go and speak and teach somewhere else. So it might be that we're on the same page. That's why they didn't come. Well,
I have no idea. And it's nice that you're supporting them. We really don't know. In fact, I wouldn't want to deprive them of their own voice by listening to somebody else talking for them. So they have abrogated their voice by not being here. All right.
Yes, that's very, very respectful of you.
Do you have any closing comments while we transition to the next speaker?
Well, I'm really looking forward to hearing what else comes out of this and to working with anybody from this conference in the future, as with our goals are similar.
Good. And
thank you very much for hosting it and organizing it.
I hope you can be part of our last discussion on Sunday, where we I'm
looking forward to it.
All right, good. Right, I'm going to stop this and